I often experience what is called a jouska. It's an odd word, but accurately describes a sort of cathartic internal conversation I often have in my head about an event I once experienced in the wilds of Namibia, way back in 2007. It's a conversation that I have quite rightly kept in my head for fear of being perceived as unhinged or mad, even. However, for reasons I will elaborate on later, I've decided to sidestep my excellences and cough up, as Rosas say, to the extent that narrating this strange encounter from nearly 2 decades ago is sort of fessing up. So here it is. Stand by. Not only did I sleep with an alien, but I met a time traveler. There, I said it. I can see the men in white coats dusting off the gurney and sending out the padded van to get me. Actually, sleeping with the alien isn't really the contentious of these two admissions, as the Hoba meteorite near Grootfontein in the Kalahari Desert is indeed an alien, and I did in fact sleep on top of this metallic cube from outer space. Now, what I'm going to talk about is the time traveler, or perhaps he's a dimension hopper, that I met in the middle of the Namib Desert in 2007. So, before I go into what happened, I should explain why it's now that I put my head above the parapet. That's the question one should ask, I suppose, isn't it? I have thought whether I should say something about this encounter. In fact, I've dipped my toe in the water by writing about it in my motorcycle travel blog, and I've told a few of my close relatives. The result? No discernible reaction whatsoever. In fairness, this is probably because no one ever reads my blog, and my few loved ones love me if I'm mad or not. So why now? Why admit to something that may have adverse repercussions? Well, it's not for money if that's what you're thinking. My YouTube channel isn't even monetized for a start. My channels are full of badly filmed and badly edited stuff, which, if I haven't used someone else's music or intellectual property, is full of me rambling a lot and not finishing any of my sentences. None of it's going to be viewed very much, especially against all the stiff competition from much better motorbike riders and more talented bloggers who increasingly make more interesting and better produced content that they use to fund and support themselves. I don't need to. The reality is, I post videos to YouTube for somewhere to keep my video album. And if I can be bothered, it forces me to tidy up my badly filmed clips and make some semblance of editing effort on my graphics challenged laptop. I'm also getting on a bit now and have already made my living doing other stuff, which has been successful enough to keep me supplied in bikes, beer, and gadgets to my end of days, provided I don't drag it out too much into my 80s and 90s. In fact, I often joke my pension plan is a Ducati Panigale and a very hard brick wall. It's not for fame or notoriety either. As someone who's been described as a classic Sigma male, somewhere on the Asperger's spectrum, fame wouldn't bring me any joy at all. In fact, quite the opposite. I am a lonely wolf with very few friends and no desire to join a biker gang, the Illuminati, or the British Short Hair Appreciation Society, even though I'm very fond of cats and motorbikes. Cathartic? Well, yes, I suppose a little bit. Confessions feel good and cleanse the soul. It's amazing how many fraudsters and corrupt corporate leaders confess to me during their interviews to clear their conscience. One of the skills, or I suppose tools, I employ in my professional life is to twang the tightrope of deception and allow people to fall gracefully into the safety net of truth. You'll be amazed how much better these corporate fraudsters feel after being unburdened from years of keeping the balls of deceit in the air. Yep, you're right. It's a frigging circus. What about causing a ruckus? Well, yes, I admit perhaps a little bit. I think the pot should be stirred a bit just to see what lurks at the bottom. This is, I think, particularly important in an increasingly authoritarian world that I feel impinges my libertarian beliefs and freedoms. But that's not the reason either, no. The reason I've decided to talk openly about the encounter is that I'm now seriously concerned that what was said to me and the images formed in my consciousness will come true. As the date that was prophesied, or should I say, remembered by the time traveler or dimension hopper or whatever or whoever he was, gets closer, I am becoming increasingly anxious, if that's the word. Maybe resigned is a better word. Yes, resigned to fate, resigned to determinism. My motive is simple: to share this bizarre and what must seem to a reasonable man unbelievable experience, to see if anyone else has ever experienced anything similar, to corroborate, or conversely, to exculpate what I was told and made to feel so that I can either prep for the Armageddon or allay my fears that I was probably suffering from some anti malarial, drug induced hallucinogenic episode of some kind. So, before I tell you what happened or what my five senses fed my meat computer to perceive, let me indulge in some antecedents so that those who don't know me can perhaps allay suspicions that I am of the nutty, the end is nigh persuasion. Please feel free to skip through this diatribe if you like. It is a tad personal for my liking, but I feel it sets the scene and puts things into context for what happened later. It is this narration is time-stamped below if you want to skip through and go, skip starters and go straight to the main course. So, at the turn of the millennia, I was working as a leader of a forensic accounting and corporate investigation practice in the now defunct Big Five accounting firm called Arthur Anderson, based out of their Singapore office. I suppose only older people will remember this firm, but it was a pretty impressive outfit at the time. When this huge global firm disintegrated in 2002, in the wake of the Enron scandal, as indeed did my marriage, unfortunately, I went on to experience a bit of a hiatus in my career. And instead of following the rest of the orphan partners to new homes in the remaining Big Four firms, I headed off to Africa, where I embarked on the beginning of what turned out to be some absolutely amazing adventures. I suppose it was a sign from the soul of the universe to live life to the full, or to fulfill my father's dying guidance to slow down and smell the roses, to reinforce the adage that life's not a dress rehearsal. Of my two walkabouts on that first trip, one was a very long hike with no equipment at all, wearing the same clothes every day, no tent, no sleeping bag, sleeping under the stars, yomping along the cliffs, dunes, and beaches, sidestepping puff adders, cowering from close lightning strikes, and wading and swimming across numerous Zambezi shark infested estuaries of the wild coast of South Africa, which I did for about 6 weeks. To be fair, I was oblivious to the existence of Zambezi sharks or bull sharks, as they're known in other places, until I completely finished the hike down in the south of the Transkei. And I can safely say, more than slightly alarmed when I found out these razor toothed beasties made their home in the estuaries I had traipsed across. The other adventure, perhaps no safer, was driving a surplus rental car that was left in Windhoek in Namibia back to its base in Johannesburg in South Africa. On that long way round rental return, I found myself exploring the wilds of Namibia, Botswana, Lesotho, and remote parts of northern South Africa, basically for free, in a Nissan 4x4 pickup truck, sleeping in the back and having the absolute time of my life. I think I put about 5,000 clicks on the clock by the time I returned a very dusty Bucky to its base in Joburg. It's during this particular adventure, I suppose, that I fell in love with Namibia. For those who haven't been, you are missing out. Namibia is vast. It's very underpopulated. It has the oldest deserts on the planet, beautiful mountains, huge sand dunes, the roaring Atlantic, the wild skeleton coast, classic African bush in the north, and primitive villages along the Caprivi Strip. It's unpolluted, fresh, has amazing flora and fauna, unearthly colors, and its remoteness is like no other. It's a very special bit of planet Earth, and nowadays, having been fortunate to have explored a great deal of our planet on various motorcycle adventures, Namibia remains one of my top two favorite countries, along with its neighbor, South Africa. After this foray into Africa, and with very little money and an estranged family to support, I accepted a job back in Hong Kong leading the corporate investigation and business intelligence practice for a wonderful and wacky risk consulting firm that was founded and led by some other former Royal Hong Kong police officers that I knew and who were kind enough to give me a home and a source of income. I have to say, it was absolutely fascinating work. I was teamed with some real legends in the security and intelligence industry and was fortunate to lead some projects that I suppose, if published in a book, would give John Le Carrier and Ben McIntyre a run for their money. Whilst my colleagues were really talented and the work really quite good fun and interesting, we collective bunch of former Rozzers and spies struggled to run the business profitably, mainly because our business development activities and outgoings were, well, let me say, rather exuberant. Anyway, after 3 years, I thought it was time to move on, and I accepted a position in one of the big accounting firms as a partner in their forensic and dispute practice out of their Shanghai and Hong Kong offices. At that time, I lived in, or I suppose what can be described as an illegal hut right next to a popular beach in the village of Seko on the rural south side of Hong Kong Island, a really lovely part of the coast of South China, and probably outside many people's impression or perception of what Hong Kong is really like. Various females, none of whom I liked particularly much, except for a cat, came and went. I swam in the sea all year round. I regularly ran along the mountain trails, kept myself extremely fit, rode to work at warp speed on my racing specification Yamaha R1. I could fly my paraglider up above the mountain ridge behind me and land it back down again right next to my modest and rather tatty hut. Whilst I'm pretty good at what I do, the pettiness and unpleasantness of the corporate world, politically motivated and mealy mouthed colleagues, a completely unplayable nutty ex missus, and what I describe as the Hong Kong knitting circle was really beginning to drag me down. Time to clear out the sock drawer. I resigned and decided to work for the best boss and employer I ever had, me. For the business plan to work, one of the things I had to achieve was a decent standard of Mandarin Chinese. Then I'd be at a significant advantage over my Guilo peers in this region, who were, you know, to be honest, at least on paper, better qualified than me within what is essentially a legal and accounting profession. I had actually learned Cantonese and used it quite often during my days in the Royal Hong Kong Police in the 1980s and 90s. But to be honest, I wasn't really very good at it. Later, after Hong Kong reverted back to China, I enrolled on some local Mandarin courses in Hong Kong, but the shurs and zhurs went straight through one ear and out the other. It just wasn't working. The only way for me to get to a reasonable standard was to immerse myself in all things Chinese, and that, of course, had to be in China. And so I signed up for an intensive Mandarin program at the prestigious Tsinghua Dashi, Tsinghua University in Beijing, starting in September 2007, and one that would last for about 2 years until I started working again. So when I escaped the painfully dull accounting firm in spring 2007, that left me with 4 to 5 months to idle about before the course started. And so I decided to buy a motorcycle in South Africa and, yeah, go off exploring. Now, with all that bollocks out of the way, and I admit it might be a bit too much for many, and if you listen to it, I apologize, but it brings me to the subject of my confession. I'm not going to recount everything I did on that expedition across southern Africa, as I've actually written about it quite extensively in my blog, the link of which can be found in the description, as YouTubers say. But after riding across South Africa on my KTM 990 adventure motorcycle, with my entire worldly possessions, literally all my stuff, strapped on the back of the bike in panniers, and I crossed the bridge over the Orange River and was now in Namibia. Ahead of me were continuous stretches of heavily corrugated gravel roads, sand tracks, rocky trails, river crossings, and later huge expanses of salt pans along the Skeleton Coast. The riding was on the enjoyable side of challenging, and I was getting used to the rather out of control feeling one gets battling a huge, fully laden enduro style motorcycle on sand and gravel. I have to say, the scenery was absolutely glorious. The colours were unearthly, the air was fresh and pure, and there were a surprisingly large number and variety of African wild animals and birds here and there. On the fourth or fifth day in Namibia, one or the other, I just don't remember, but it was either the fourth or the fifth. I was riding in a particularly desolate area in the heart of the Namib Desert when I saw a figure shimmering in the heat haze ahead. As I drew closer, I realized it was a man. He looked quite strange, was quite tall, exceptionally thin, and had his head concealed in a hoodie. He was dressed in a sort of mishmash of layers of dark clothes, like a sort of street sleeper tramp one sees sitting on a cardboard box in an English city, except without a dog or selling the big issue. I drew up alongside him and asked if he was okay or needed anything. I'm fine, came the reply, in a really thick and difficult to understand accent. I'm not even going to try to mimic it, but the closest I could describe is a mix of Billy Connolly and Ian Paisley, sort of Belfast meets Glasgow. But not only did he have a strange accent, but he had a very deep, almost metallic tone to his voice. Instinctively, my old brain knew something was odd, and my hackles rose, or at least the hair on the back of my neck. Fight or flight. I did neither. I was sort of mesmerized. I couldn't really see his face in the hoodie, but I got the impression he was European. I racked my brain to this day to try and recollect any distinctive features. All I can remember is his face seemed very narrow, his cheeks extremely sunken, and his head quite big, or at least his hoodie seemed disproportionately large. He also had wrap-around, very dark sunglasses, and so I couldn't see his eyes at all. I took off my helmet and looked around me from horizon to horizon at the magnificent desolation, to borrow the expression from Buzz Aldrin, and asked the obvious questions of where he'd come from and where's he going. At the time, I didn't fully comprehend what I was being told and what I was experiencing. Some things were clear from the start. Some things emerged over the coming days as the missing time filled with recollections of the conversation and crystal clear visions of strange events. He answered, I've crossed many times, and went on to explain he was looking for Namib desert elephants. Although vaguely aware this type of elephant existed, I'd not seen one yet. Later I would, and I did encounter them here and there and found them to be huge, long-legged, as elephants go, and very light grey in colour. In fact, a few weeks later, near Etosha, I was visited by a huge bull elephant in the middle of the night when I was sleeping on a sun lounger at a bush resort, and was a little alarmed when this colossal creature snuffled and prodded me with his trunk. I later found out this was a rather famous elephant that the locals christened Sebastian, and he used to come into the resort to drink water from the pool and eat apple ring pods from the trees. Anyway, I told the hooded man I hadn't seen any elephants, just some impala, box, wild horses, donkeys, goats, and cattle here and there, a few mongooses and other things scurrying across the road. Later, I would see all sorts of animals, including rhinos, antelopes, ostriches, giraffe, lions, even leopards, some zebras, jackals, and of course, quite a few elephants. But on day 4 or 5 in the southwest of Namibia, that's all I had seen so far. I asked him if he was hungry, but he said he wasn't. Nonetheless, I fished around in my supplies and gave him a bread roll and a bottle of water. He took the roll without any expression of gratitude, which I found a bit odd, but he gave me back the water, saying I should keep it to stay hydrated. It was all very strange, too strange. Very difficult to describe the feelings I had, but then riding alone in far off places is often very strange, especially in Africa. In these parts, ancient nomadic bushmen lived off the land and had done so for millennia, but he certainly did not look or sound like a Namib Khoisan bushman, like the lead character in the cult movie The Gods Must Be Crazy. If I had to pin a race on him, it would be European. I did wonder if he is one of those eccentric hippie types that have given up on regular society and gone off to live like a nomad in the wilds. We chatted a bit about my planned trip and the fact that afterwards I was going to China to learn Mandarin, to which he commented words to the effect, ah, yes, the language of your future. He then gave an unsolicited piece of advice that I should only work for myself and find a Chinese soulmate to hold my hand and guide me to success, which I didn't actually give much thought to, other than he was just making small talk about my plans in China. What was even more strange is what appeared to be a 5 minute conversation was, in fact, 1.5 hours. That was the actual time I spent with him before riding off again. Let me explain how I know this. On this trip back then, I didn't have a GPS or sat nav and was just using a few old school tourist paper maps that I got from petrol stations here and there. Not very detailed, and I stuck them between the seat of my bike and the petrol tank. And if I needed to consult them or have a look at them, I'd have to stop my bike. I also had a Nokia mobile phone, not a smartphone like we have today that you can connect to the internet, but a small mobile phone, common in those days that you could put a foreign SIM card in. I rarely used it, if at all, as I rarely had a signal, and in any case, it was just for emergencies. However, I did keep track of time very carefully, as I had to navigate long stretches and estimate when I would get to various waypoints, junctions, or fuel stops. Fuel was a major issue for me on that trip, and indeed on other trips, and I was always monitoring my range and where and when I could refuel. That's how I know I spent a total of 1.5 hours with him, sometime in the early afternoon. Only after I got riding again and realized I was late did I realize how much time I actually spent with him in the middle of nowhere. Also, apart from where all the missing time went and what he said, there was another thing nagging at the back of my mind. He had no bag. I'd been riding for hours in the Namib Desert on sandy and rocky trails, and there was absolutely nothing around. And later, after I rode off, there was still nothing around for hours. And I'd be riding at about, between 80 and 120 kilometers an hour. That was sort of my average. And yet, there he was, a weird looking skinny man in a hoodie in the middle of the Namib Desert looking for desert elephants without a bag. I had all my supplies, extra fuel, camping gear, sleeping bag, tools, repair and maintenance kit, extra clothes, all packed away in my two side panniers and a dry bag. He had absolutely nothing with him, no supplies whatsoever, and he was miles from anywhere. One of the pieces of the puzzle that causes me more and more alarm was when I told him that I had ridden up from my house in South Africa. He went on to remark that South Africa was a safe place to be when the West was plunged into a devastating war in 20 years' time. Fuck me, where did that come from? 20 years into my future, and by inference from his language, a historical event in the past. I remember thinking that was a bloody strange thing to say, but I didn't dig any deeper, thinking at the time he was using sort of uneducated, chavvy we was grammar and might be one of those the end is nigh types you see waving a placard and wandering around an American city. I admit the thought did pass through my brain that he might be from a different dimension or time, but dismissed it almost immediately as impossible. Had to be. I was just spooking myself. I also wondered if I was experiencing something spiritual, a sort of religious thing of some kind. As a Catholic of the Roman kind, I had been brought up with all sorts of Neolithic and medieval stories in the Bible, and some seriously strange shit happened in all of those stories. I also wondered if I had crashed and died and was being escorted to the white light on the other side by this angel. Who knows what happens when you die? And indeed, if your consciousness and sense of being continues to know you have died. All these strange thoughts flashed through my mind and unnerved me. I really don't like being confused or out of control. Apart from 10 pints of Marston's pedigree, I don't really like being fucked up, and nowadays I don't even do that. My only highs are spiral diving my paraglider, downhill mountain biking, riding my motorcycles, and maybe a gummy bear watching the movie Apocalypto. However, in the following days, jigsaw pieces of the missing time would suddenly appear in my mind and fill in the gaps of my memory, and this was really haunting me, as it started to do again recently. Often, when I was alone in my tent at the end of a long day of riding, my brain would go over and over the strange encounter. Slowly, dreams turned into nightmares, and the missing time started being filled with disturbing prophecies about devastating civil unrest, full blown riots, military intervention, and all out war that plunged parts of Europe into a wasteland in crystal clear 4K resolution. Of course, I've dismissed this as my imagination running wild and confusing sci fi dystopian fiction like Blade Runner, Terminator, and Mad Max with reality. But the recollected images were too clear, crystal clear, strange beyond my imagination, very scary and disturbing. In my dreams, I could see places I know in England destroyed and places I don't know but seem like they're in France or Germany, leveled to the ground. If he was from the future, why would he even tell me this stuff anyway? Can I prevent a war? Can I warn people of the dangers? Can I even escape? Back in 2007, there was nothing to suggest any of this was feasible or could come true anyway. He never disclosed anything useful like winning lottery ticket numbers, although some of the advice about having a loyal and loving Chinese partner, working for myself, and becoming successful did come true. But he might have been employing one of those fortune teller tricks where they tell you what you disclosed already, or just making calculated guesses. At the time, I had nothing to worry about and fear. There was nothing to suggest the West was in danger. We were living the dream. Little did I know. I could never envisage what would lie ahead in the following decades or so. In 2007, Bush and Blair had yet to inflame radical Islam and make many parts of Africa and the Middle East unstable and unsafe. Russia and Ukraine had yet to engage in a proxy perpetual war caused by NATO expansion, propelled, and I should say funded, by the EU and US and their industrial military complex, and the liberal elite. In fact, in those days, being called liberal was generally considered a good thing. The Iranian funded terror group Hamas had invaded Israel and murdered and raped youngsters at a music festival and committed unspeakable atrocities against innocent little babies, causing a war between Jewish Judeans and Arab Palestinians, if those are the right words to describe the tribes that populate the troubled Holy Lands of the Levant. Unless one has an IQ below room temperature or spent geography and history lessons at school smoking nettles behind the bike sheds, it's very easy to know that Judaism emerged more than 1,000 years before Islam, and which tribes lived in which parts of the Levant at any particular time. And Saudi, Egypt, and Jordan, yeah, they don't think much of Palestinians either or their aggression. They don't make room for them in their huge area. They make up 99% of the landmass in the Middle East. The Western liberal elite, the BLT plus HP source mafia, and the anti Semites have been very selective about this very small bit of the Middle East to get hot and bothered about, haven't they? Back in 2007, the Middle East region was still run by strong, although I will admit, despot type leaders, but they prevented regional turmoil and tribal conflict. They kept the tribal warlords and the religious extremists in order. America hadn't been polarized into two hostile adversaries of diametrically opposed politics and extreme non scientific beliefs. Europe hadn't been flooded with fighting age illegal immigrants from hostile foreign cultures that threaten the indigenous European population with Bronze Age superstitions, Sharia law, and the settled intention of a European caliphate. British and European cities were still quite nice back then and had yet to develop no go ghettos that they have today. A certain religion hadn't started stabbing, decapitating, and hacking innocent people to death on European streets. I had never heard of grooming gangs. One would have assumed back then they were overzealous poodle owners. Douglas Murray hadn't written his books, The War on the West, The Strange Death of Europe, and The Madness of the Crowds, all frighteningly prophetic, articulate, and insightful. Science and common sense prevailed. Men were men, women were women, and they liked each other. Men who wore dresses were funny, like Dame Edna, Lily Savage, and Mrs. Doubtfire. Only people who went to grammar schools knew what a pronoun was. No one had heard of the word woke, and rainbows were associated with Jeffrey, Bungle, and Zippy. Free speech was taken for granted. Britain didn't need a First Amendment. We're British, don't you know? Tea, queuing, pubs, politeness, and free expression went without saying. No one had ever heard of BLM, Antifa, ISIS, cancel culture, meme, gaslighting, white privilege, or any of that guff language. You could still go on holiday to Damascus. There hadn't been any blasphemy laws in Europe since the bloody Spanish Inquisition. Children could go to dance classes without being slaughtered. Back then, the police were impartial, trusted, and respected, and one could rely on the mainstream media, and particularly the BBC, to report the news impartially without bias and deception. All that changed in less than 2 decades. There is no arguing that things have got worse and society is deeply divided. For someone like me that spends very little time in the UK, I've watched from afar as my motherland, and indeed the West in general, descends into a sort of cultural dystopia. I barely recognize the country I'm indigenous to and was raised in. I barely recognize West Europe, the continent my ancestors evolved in and went on to generate the greatest minds, art, music, scientific achievements, inventions, and accomplishments the world has ever seen. Without prejudice, I guess one has to be careful nowadays what one says. I will summarize some very recent events for the purpose of context and to give a personal perspective and objectivity. On a recent visit to England, where I keep a Royal Enfield Marlian motorcycle at my sister's lovely house in Poole in Dorset, I was washing my bike in a driveway and readying it for storage when an obese black woman in ill fitting, tight, and I can only describe as hooker gear walked up the private driveway, scoped out the house and the cars. I know this because I was a cop and recognized the behavior, and then called someone on her phone in an African language while pointing at the cars, and then she wobbled off. A little while later, while driving with my sister in a car in the leafy, affluent neighborhood, I saw the fat ass twerker doing the same thing along other driveways. I pointed her out to my sister and told her what I saw, and she agreed it was strange and suspicious. But she seemed resigned to the fact that this is what Britain is like nowadays. White, especially middle class Brits, seem reluctant to report suspicious behaviour by non whites for fear of being branded racist. And it's now the case that the police wouldn't do anything anyway. Lo and behold, at 5:30 a.m. the next day, my brother-in-law's Jaguar 4x4 is stolen off the driveway. An examination of the security cameras revealed a black guy in a hoodie stealing it. Could have been a white guy with black legs and arms and an African round arse, but unlikely. Not a cop to be seen, and none ever came to investigate what I would describe as the dishonest appropriation of property belonging to another with the intention of permanently depriving the other of it, and thief and steal shall be construed accordingly. Value 30,000 quid. The car, legally property, belonging to my brother in law was never found, therefore permanently deprived, and the tracker discarded in nearby Christchurch, proving dishonesty and permanence. I rest my case, Your Worship. We're all told by the new British leaders of, how do I say, ethnic persuasion. We should accept this as part and parcel to living in multicultural Britain. Was anyone in Britain actually asked if that's what they want? Indigenous Brits are constantly told that they are being enriched by an invasion of the third world and that anarchy and lawlessness is the new normal. During my time in Bournemouth and Poole, I saw several places, and indeed in other parts of England, where flowers had been placed on footpaths and by the side of the road for people murdered in recent knife attacks, including two women on the beach at Branksome Chime, where my sister keeps a beach hut. When I got back to Hong Kong, I watched in horror as the international news reported the slaughter of little children going to a Taylor Swift themed dance class in Stockport, northwest England. I witnessed and recognized a cover up by the establishment, and I was unsurprised by the subsequent riots by angry mobs. People, of course, reacted in anger, expressing discontent on social media that resulted in the newly elected cultural Marxist government branding them all far right, and then proceeded in arresting only white people, or should I say, white working class people, for expressing this anger, arguing they were inciting racial hatred. If I hear another lefty DEI hired cop waffle on about protecting communities, I will go even more crazy than I appear to be. There should be only one community in Britain, the British community. Also, the slur far right is levelled at anyone who criticises or challenges the Marxist government. What is far right anyway? And how does it differ from just right or moderately right? Isn't anyone who is not a Marxist or a pinko commie subversive bedwetter right by process of elimination? And anyone who is vaguely patriotic, who wants to protect their way of life, culture, and borders, is labeled racist. Personally, I don't care what race someone is. I don't think the vast majority of British people do either. Variety is the spice of life and all that. However, I believe all races in a particular country should be of one culture. That is the culture of the country they decided to immigrate to. Otherwise, it creates strain and conflict. I have never heard of Sikhs, Buddhists, Taoists, Hindus, Jews, Christians, or even atheists causing trouble. However, the special needs Bronze Age death cult wants to kill people of other beliefs and impose their superstitions on the indigenous population of the country they illegally immigrated to. And don't tell me they don't. It says so clearly in their beloved and noisily narrated instruction manual that they inflict on us 5 times a day. This highly invasive and aggressive cult has the backing of the UK government and police, who threaten the indigenous populace that any phobias or anti establishment sentiment will be punished, punished. Anti establishment. The Sex Pistols and John Cooper Clarke better watch out. The thought police are coming. And phobia. Isn't that an irrational fear? I have a very rational fear of medieval death cults, and I will not be bullied or intimidated into deciding what I like, love, or fear. The Attorney General of the UK and several chief constables said they will scour the internet, kick down doors, arrest so called far right criminals just for expressing their views, and lock them up in prison for lengthy sentences. And to my horror, they did. Facebook, Twitter, and other social media comments of discontent and anger expressed, in the vernacular of typical working class people, resulted in expedited and disproportionately lengthy jail sentences. Innocent until proven guilty was replaced with guilty until induced and coerced by the police through fear or favour, especially the threat of being remanded indefinitely in custody, to plead guilty. I know this happens. Several serving cops I know told me they do it. They have always done this. They did this when I was a cop. Only the special needs community who get publicly funded communist lawyers, and of course the hardened criminals who know how the corrupt judicial system works, plead not guilty and get bailed pending their trial. If everyone pleaded not guilty, the criminal justice system would grind to a halt. To make space in the jails for those accused of thought crimes, most of whom were of previous good character, the government is releasing tens of thousands of real hardened criminals back onto the streets. Didn't Pontius Pilate release the hardened criminal, what's his name, Barabbas, so that they could crucify Jesus instead? It's completely mad and it's unjust. Conversely, I watched a video on TV of thugs of the protected special needs variety at Manchester Airport violently beating up armed police and breaking a policewoman's nose. The only action taken was that the police officer struggling to effect the arrest of the violent thugs was struck off and suspended pending a lengthy and stressful internal investigation. As a former armed police officer myself back in the day, I can say I would have been justified in using lethal force in this exact scenario. Instead, the officer is vilified for using his feet, a perfectly sound tactic that kept his arms free to protect his lethal weapon getting into the hands of these violent thugs. who were clearly emboldened to believe they are above the law of the land. As I speak, the violent thugs remain at liberty. However, the officer who bravely performed his duty in protecting his colleagues and the public, and indeed his family, is being punished, vilified, and labeled as a criminal of some sort. This is two-tier policing by any measure, which to my mind and anyone who has studied law is a desecration of the tenets of the rule of law, not to mention democracy, fairness, justice, civilization, decency, and Englishness. It's a corrupted criminal justice system, and no wonder that people are angry, especially the working class, who used to rely on the Labour Party to fight their corner. Not anymore. It's not inaccurate to say that this attack on free speech is tyrannical, and this is a strain on society which is already at breaking point. George Orwell's book 1984 was a warning, not a friggin' instruction manual. Two and two equals five, otherwise it's room 101, the worst possible thing for you, Mr. Smith. The trouble with being tortured with the worst possible thing is that after a while, it's not the worst possible thing anymore. You get used to it. After a while, the rats aren't so bad. Once you criminalize or label a person, there's no going back. The worst day in prison is the first. The worst week in prison is the first week, and so on. One adapts and becomes what you made them. The guy who shouted at the police dog, or the one who put lawful stickers on lampposts, are now criminals. The corrupt criminal justice system decided they should be labelled, and as such, their lives, their minds, and indeed their families will never be the same again. Their employment opportunities, their self esteem, their sense of justice and fair play, their position in society, their liberty, never the same again. The corrupt authoritarian establishment has created dozens, if not thousands, of enemies of the state just for one angry man shouting at a police dog. As the adage goes, you might as well get hanged for a sheep as a lamb. With 3 years to go before the prophecies of the hooded man come to fruition, it seems more and more pieces are fitting together, and the scene has been set. The mainstream media spouts ingsoc propaganda over the airways. Morality and decency has been turned upside down. Being white is vilified, and worse, their voice has been criminalized. I've never ever witnessed such suppressed anger and discontent. The government's tyrannical approach has backfired. They have driven a rebellion underground. Dit da dit 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 dit. Europe is indeed a tinderbox ready to blow. I don't know what to say. If indeed, for the sake of my liberty, I'm allowed to. The double standards of the British government is nauseous. A few years back, the British gave refuge to the arsonists, seditious traitors, and wanted criminals from Hong Kong. These are ones who burned our coffee shops, smashed up the Legislative Council, and assaulted police. They even set fire to an old man. Ironically, the hypocritical British government cancelled the extradition treaty between the UK and Hong Kong, as Hong Kong because Hong Kong sought the return of the criminals and justice, which on balance is a good thing, because now I am in Hong Kong calling out the emperor for wearing no clothes. Thank God I'm in China. Who would have thought it the refuge for liberty, freedom, and justice compared to the country of the Magna Carta? The Orwellian dystopia is happening in Europe. Censorship, thought crimes, arrests for so called non crimes. book burning, revisionism, man is woman, woman is man, the Ministry of Truth altering history to fit the authoritarian government's narrative, omnipresent surveillance, and increasing restrictions, the role of the family replaced by the dictates of the state, a constant supply of enemies to hate and wars to fight. The totalitarian regime of Oceania, I mean the lefty globalists, NATO, the EU, WHO, WEF, manipulates citizens into believing anything they want, giving them total power to control. He who controls the past controls the future, scaring the population with fears of pandemics, drowning in floods, burning in scorching heat, and climate catastrophes, so they are compliant and easily manipulated. As 2027 approaches, I think back to what the hooded man told me. The scene is set for a European civil war, maybe an American one too. The problem is, everything we are taught and told suggests time travel or crossing from one dimension to another is impossible if indeed there are multi dimensions. It's the stuff of science fiction, although I understand a photon doesn't see time because of the speed of light and theory of relativity. I am acutely aware we human beings think we are the center of everything, brainwashed by religion, conditioned by social mores, and slaves to our human frailties and vices. Not being as well versed in quantum mechanics or the second law of thermodynamics as Sir Roger Penrose or Professor Stephen Hawkins, I have tried to get my head around this science non fiction event. I can't. But then science is an evolving subject. What was science fiction in the past is science fact today. What if time tourists are among us all the time with nothing to distinguish them from us? Unless, of course, they come from the far distant future and their appearance has evolved into a seemingly different being that looks alien. Maybe all the UFOs that are seen are not from far away alien planets, but are crafts and devices from different dimensions or time. I remember back then as the thoroughly bizarre encounter came to a sort of natural end. He waved goodbye and then walked away. I found it difficult not to watch him as he trundled off and disappeared into the heat haze of the desert. Something unearthly, or at least outside our current comprehension, happened in those 90 minutes that I can't explain and probably never will. In a way, I wish it never happened, and that my only strange encounters were with Sebastian the desert elephant and Charlie Borman and Ewan McGregor, who I bumped into later in Zambia. However, it did happen, and I have often thought about this encounter, tried to work through some rational explanations, wondered what to do about this revelation, and in the past I've decided not to make a song and dance about it because, as I said, being perceived as mad is generally frowned upon. Even when I recount regular events from my life, from the days I was in the police or from my global travels, nobody ever believes me. No one's ever going to believe me that I bumped into a time traveler, except perhaps the time traveler and his kind, who may listen to this digitized account in years to come. However, I'm increasingly, how should I put it, concerned, haunted even by all of this. And so much so that this year I actually rode back to Namibia, this time on my KTM 1190 Adventure R, and tried to find the spot where I met the stranger. I thought if I could reinstate context by being back on the scene, it might cognitively jog my memory. I hoped in a strange way I would actually bump into him again and give him a grilling, find out what's going on. Alas, no. I didn't even see a desert elephant. I suppose the obvious conclusion is that he was some sort of eccentric wandering nomad or mad, as indeed people who watch or listen to this will think I am. What he said was just small talk, and it could be interpreted any way you want, and that maybe dehydration, heat stroke, anti malaria medication, and post event interference and suggestibility has corrupted my memory. However, as time goes on and we get closer to 2027, as I witness the injustices directed at native Europeans, the perversion of morality, and the madness of the crowd, I'm just not so sure. I'm increasingly thinking of what happened 17 years ago. And I'm thinking perhaps I should be stocking up on, I don't know, baked beans, water, petrol, or perhaps prepping for the long term with some solar panels, chickens, and seeds at my place on the very southern tip of Africa, well away from the white flash in the northern hemisphere. Zaijian.